close your eyes and let yourself drift back through the mists of time. Tonight, we're going to walk together through a world you think you know, but don't. A world of knights and shining armor, of noble quests and heroic deeds. But here's the thing nobody tells you. That shining armor, it was a prison. Those heroic deeds, they were nightmares. And those noble knights, they were some of the most miserable, broken, and utterly screwed over people in human history. So settle in, get comfortable, and let me tell you a story, a real story, about what it actually meant to be a knight in the Middle Ages. And I promise you, by the time we're done, you'll never look at a suit of armor the same way again. But before we begin this journey into the past, if you're enjoying this deep dive into history's uncomfortable truths, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you're going to want to stick around for where this story goes. And drop a like if you're already feeling that delicious historical dread setting in. Comments too. Let me know what historical myths you want me to destroy next. Now, let's begin. The year is 1347. Our story starts in a place you've probably never heard of, a small village in the French countryside called Montfort-sur-Risle. The morning sun hasn't quite broken over the horizon yet, and there's a young boy named Guillaume, barely 16 years old, standing in a muddy courtyard wearing 70 pounds of steel that doesn't fit him right. His shoulders are already screaming. His thighs are chafing so badly he can feel the wetness of blood mixing with sweat inside his armor. And he's been standing here for 3 hours already, holding a lance that weighs more than his little sister, waiting for his lord to finish breakfast so the day's training can begin. Guillaume became a knight 3 months ago. 3 months, and he's already wondering if this is how he's going to die. Not in glorious combat, not defending the weak or rescuing maidens, but right here, in this courtyard, from sheer exhaustion and infected saddle sores. You see, Guillaume believed the stories. We all do. We're told that knights were these noble warriors, these paragons of virtue who lived by a sacred code of chivalry. We're told they were respected, wealthy, powerful. We're told that becoming a knight was the ultimate achievement, the medieval equivalent of making it big. We're told a lot of things. The truth? Being a knight sucked. Like really, truly, mind-numbingly, body-destroyingly, soul-crushingly sucked. And Guillaume is about to learn just how badly. But let's back up a bit, because to understand why Guillaume's life is about to become a living hell, we need to understand how someone even became a knight in the first place. And spoiler alert, it wasn't some magical ceremony where you got dubbed with a sword and suddenly became a badass. It was more like signing up for decades of unpaid labor, physical abuse, and financial ruin. Guillaume's story actually starts when he was 7 years old. 7. That's when his father, a minor nobleman who owned about 3 acres of halfway decent farmland and a house that leaked when it rained, sent him away to serve as a page in the household of Lord Bertrand de Montfort. Now, you might be thinking this sounds kind of prestigious. Page to a lord? That's pretty good, right? Wrong. Being a page meant Guillaume was basically a servant. A fancy servant, sure, but a servant nonetheless. His days started before dawn, when he'd have to help the other pages prepare the great hall for breakfast. He'd lay out the tables, bring in the bread, make sure the lord's chair had the right cushions. Then he'd stand behind that chair while Lord Bertrand ate, ready to refill his wine cup or fetch whatever the lord needed. After breakfast, he'd help clean up, then spend the rest of the morning learning to read and write, which sounds educational until you realize the only thing they were teaching him to read was Latin scripture and feudal law.
In the afternoons, Guillaume would train. And by train, I mean he'd get the absolute crap beaten out of him by older boys who were further along in their training. They'd practice with wooden swords that left bruises the size of apples. They'd wrestle in the mud until someone couldn't breathe anymore. They'd run laps around the castle grounds carrying heavy stones. And if Guillaume complained, if he cried, if he showed any weakness at all, he'd get beaten worse the next day. This went on for 7 years. 7 years of servitude, of beatings, of sleeping on the floor with the dogs because pages didn't get real beds. 7 years of being at the absolute bottom of the social hierarchy within the castle, lower than the actual paid servants, because at least the servants got to go home at night. But Guillaume survived. He got tougher, harder, meaner. He learned to take a punch and give one back. He learned which older boys to avoid and which ones he could manipulate. He learned how to navigate the brutal social dynamics of a medieval household where everyone was constantly competing for scraps of approval from the Lord. And when he turned 14, Guillaume was promoted to squire. Now, being a squire was supposedly a step up, and in some ways it was. Guillaume got to actually train with real weapons now, not just wooden practice swords. He learned how to ride a war horse, which is nothing like riding a regular horse. War horses were massive, aggressive animals, bred specifically for combat, and they'd just as soon bite your face off as carry you anywhere. Guillaume got thrown more times than he could count, broke his collarbone twice, and developed a healthy fear of anything with 4 legs and an attitude problem. But here's where things got really expensive, because as a squire, Guillaume was expected to follow his knight into battle, and Lord Bertrand's knight, a grizzled warrior named Sir Arnaud, who had approximately 0 patience for teenage boys, went into battle a lot. The first time Guillaume saw real combat, he was 15 years old. Sir Arnaud was called to join a campaign against a rival lord's forces, some petty dispute over land that Guillaume didn't understand and didn't care about. All he knew was that he was suddenly on a horse, wearing armor that was too big for him, holding a lance he could barely control, riding toward a line of men who wanted to kill him. The noise was the first thing that hit him. Not the sight of the enemy, not the smell of sweat and horse and metal. The noise. Hundreds of men screaming, horses shrieking, metal crashing against metal. And underneath it all, this wet, terrible sound of weapons hitting flesh. Guillaume had never heard anything like it. It was like the whole world was ending right there in that muddy field. And then they were in it. Sir Arnaud was fighting someone. Guillaume couldn't see who, and suddenly there was a man right in front of Guillaume, a man with a sword, a man who was trying to kill him. Guillaume didn't think, he just reacted, jabbing with his lance, and by some miracle, it connected. The man went down. Guillaume didn't stop to think about whether he was dead or just wounded. He just kept moving, kept following Sir Arnaud, kept trying not to die. The battle lasted maybe 20 minutes. It felt like a lifetime. When it was over, Guillaume dismounted and immediately vomited. Then he helped Sir Arnaud out of his armor, cleaned the blood off the metal, and tried not to look at the bodies being stripped by scavengers in the field behind them.
That night, Guillaume couldn't sleep. He kept seeing that man's face the moment the lance hit him. He kept hearing the sounds. He kept smelling the blood. Welcome to knighthood, kid. But Guillaume hadn't even been knighted yet. That would come later, after 2 more years of this, after more battles and more bodies and more nights when he couldn't sleep. And when the ceremony finally came, when Lord Bertrand finally deemed him worthy of being dubbed a knight, Guillaume knelt in the castle chapel and felt nothing. No pride, no sense of accomplishment, just exhaustion and a vague sense of dread about what came next. Because now Guillaume was responsible for everything. He needed his own armor, his own weapons, his own horse, multiple horses actually, a war horse for combat, a riding horse for travel, and at least 1 pack horse to carry all his equipment. He needed a squire of his own, which meant taking on some poor kid and putting him through the same hell Guillaume had just survived. He needed to maintain all of this equipment, pay for all these animals, feed all these mouths. And how was he supposed to do that? By fighting in wars, of course, by serving his lord whenever called upon, by participating in tournaments where he could win prize money if he was good enough and didn't get killed. Oh, and about tournaments. You know how they're portrayed in movies? All colorful banners and cheering crowds and romantic gestures to fair maidens? Yeah, that's horse shit. Medieval tournaments were bloodbaths. Knights died all the time. They got trampled by horses, crushed by falling opponents, struck in the eye by a lance that went through the visor slit. The sport of jousting was basically sanctioned violence, where men on horses tried to knock each other unconscious at high speed. And Guillaume wasn't very good at it. His first tournament, he lasted exactly one round before getting absolutely demolished by a knight twice his age and 3 times his skill level. The lance hit Guillaume square in the chest, shattered on impact, and sent him flying backward off his horse. He landed so hard he saw stars. His armor was dented so badly, it took a blacksmith 3 days to fix. Guillaume made 0 money, lost his entry fee, and went home with bruised ribs and a bruised ego. But he had to keep trying, because this was his job now. This was how knights made money. They either won tournaments, or they fought in wars, and if they were really lucky, they captured an enemy knight and ransomed him back to his family. That was the real way to get rich as a knight, capturing valuable prisoners and demanding payment for their release. Of course, this also meant that Guillaume could be captured, and if his family couldn't afford his ransom, he'd just rot in some dungeon until he died or until his captors got bored and killed him. So yeah, being a knight was basically one long series of life-threatening situations interspersed with crippling debt and chronic pain. Let's talk about that chronic pain for a minute, because this is something nobody tells you about medieval knights. These guys were absolutely destroyed physically. Guillaume wasn't even 20 years old yet, and his body was already falling apart. His knees were shot from years of kneeling in armor. His back was constantly in pain from the weight of wearing 70 pounds of steel for hours at a time. He had scars all over his body from training accidents, from battles, from tournaments. One of his fingers was permanently bent at a weird angle because it had been broken and never set properly. He had chronic saddle sores that got infected regularly because medieval hygiene was, let's be honest, pretty much non-existent. And he was losing teeth, which was just sort of what happened to everyone back then. But the constant blows to the head from combat probably weren't helping. And speaking of blows to the head, let's talk about what armor actually does and doesn't do. Because there's this misconception that wearing plate armor made you invincible, like you were basically a medieval tank. The reality? Armor protected you from cuts and stabs, sure, but it did absolutely nothing against blunt force trauma. When Guillaume got hit with a mace or a warhammer, or even just a really solid punch, the armor transferred all that force directly to his body. His bones would bruise, his organs would bruise. He'd get concussions over and over again, because getting hit in the helmet was like getting hit in the head with a metal bucket. The armor didn't absorb the impact, it just kept his skull from splitting open while his brain rattled around inside. Modern doctors would immediately diagnose Guillaume with chronic traumatic encephalopathy, the same condition that destroys the brains of football players. Medieval people just called it being punch drunk and figured it was normal for knights to get progressively more confused and forgetful and irritable as they aged. Guillaume was showing symptoms before he turned 25. But let's get back to the story, because Guillaume's life is about to get so much worse. Remember how I mentioned the year was 1347? That's important, because 1347 is when everything changed. That's when the Black Death arrived in Europe. Guillaume first heard about the plague in the fall, rumors from the port cities, stories about a sickness that killed people in days, sometimes hours, whole towns being wiped out, bodies piling up in the streets because there was nobody left alive to bury them. Guillaume didn't pay much attention at first. Disease was common enough. People died all the time from fevers and flux and mysterious ailments that nobody understood. What was one more sickness?
And then it came to Montfort-sur-l'Oreille. The first person to die was a merchant who'd been traveling through the region. He came down with a fever one evening, complained of terrible pain, and was dead by morning. Within a week, half the village was sick. Within 2 weeks, half of those were dead. The plague didn't discriminate. It killed peasants and nobles, young and old, strong and weak. It killed Lord Bertrand's wife. It killed 2 of his children. It killed most of the servants in the castle, most of the soldiers, most of the people Guillaume had known his entire life. Guillaume got sick too. The fever hit him like a hammer, and suddenly he was lying in his bed, unable to move, unable to think, just burning up from the inside. He felt the swellings appear under his arms and in his groin, painful lumps the size of eggs. He coughed up blood. He was certain he was going to die. But he didn't. For some reason, whether through sheer luck or some quirk of his constitution, Guillaume survived. The fever broke after 5 days. The swellings eventually went down. He was weak as a kitten for weeks afterward, barely able to stand, but he was alive. Most people weren't. The plague killed somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population. Let that sink in for a moment. 1 out of every 2 or 3 people you knew, dead within a couple of years. Entire villages abandoned, fields left unplowed because there was nobody left to work them, churches overflowing with bodies because there was nobody left to dig graves. And for knights like Guillaume, the plague changed everything. You see, the feudal system depended on peasants. Peasants worked the land, paid taxes, provided food and resources for the nobility. But now there weren't enough peasants. The ones who survived suddenly had options. They could demand higher wages, better treatment, could even leave and find work elsewhere because labor was suddenly scarce. Lords like Bertrand found themselves desperately trying to hold on to their remaining peasants, offering deals and concessions that would have been unthinkable before the plague. And knights like Guillaume found themselves with less money, less support, less of everything, because the entire economic system was collapsing. Guillaume's income from his small land holdings basically disappeared. The peasants who'd been working his fields were either dead or had left to find better opportunities elsewhere. He couldn't afford to maintain his armor properly. He couldn't afford to keep multiple horses. He couldn't afford a squire anymore. He was doing everything himself and barely managing that. And then Lord Bertrand called his knights together and told him he was going to war. Not just any war. This was the big one, the conflict that would later be known as the 100 Years' War, the massive, devastating struggle between England and France for control of the French throne. And Lord Bertrand, as a vassal of the French king, was obligated to provide military service, which meant Guillaume was obligated to go. So Guillaume put on his battered, poorly maintained armor, climbed onto his aging warhorse, and rode off to war. The campaign was a disaster from the start. The English forces, led by King Edward III and his son, the Black Prince, were better organized, better equipped, and better led than the French. They had longbowmen, thousands of them, peasants with simple wooden bows who could shoot arrows faster and farther than anyone expected. Guillaume's first major battle in this war was at a place called Crécy, August 26, 1346. It's one of the most famous battles of the medieval period, and for Guillaume, it was pure hell. The French army, including Guillaume and the other knights from Lord Bertrand's household, was exhausted from marching. They'd been on the road for days, sleeping rough, eating poorly. The nobles were arguing with each other about tactics, about who should have the honor of leading the charge, about stupid, petty things that didn't matter. And then they saw the English position. The English had set up on a ridge, a perfect defensive position. Their longbowmen were arranged in formation, thousands of them, just waiting. Any military commander with half a brain would have looked at that setup and decided to wait, to rest the troops, to come up with an actual plan. Instead, the French nobles, in their infinite wisdom, decided to charge immediately. They wanted glory. They wanted to prove their courage. They wanted to be the ones who defeated the English in glorious combat. Guillaume tried to explain to Lord Bertrand that this was insane, that charging uphill into prepared archers was suicide.
Lord Bertrand told him to shut up and do his duty. So Guillaume shut up and did his duty.
The charge began in the late afternoon. Thousands of French knights, the flower of French nobility, the most feared warriors in Europe, all thundering toward the English lines in their expensive armor, on their expensive horses, ready to crush the English beneath their might. And then, the arrows started falling. If you've never seen what a medieval longbow can do, let me paint you a picture. English longbowmen could shoot 10 to 12 arrows per minute. They could hit a man-sized target at 200 yards, and their arrows could punch through chainmail at close range. Now imagine thousands of these archers all shooting at the same time, all aiming at a densely packed group of knights charging uphill. It was a massacre. Horses went down screaming, arrows sticking out of their necks and chests. Knights were hit while still in the saddle, arrows finding the gaps in their armor, the joints, the eye slits. Men fell and were trampled by the horses behind them. The noise was indescribable, a roar of chaos and death that drowned out everything else. Guillaume's horse was hit in the first volley. The animal went down hard, and Guillaume barely managed to get his leg out from under it before the beast rolled over. He hit the ground in 70 pounds of armor, got the wind knocked out of him, and looked up just in time to see another knight's horse about to trample him. He rolled purely on instinct, and the hooves missed his head by inches. He tried to stand up, but standing up in full armor is hard enough on flat ground, let alone on a muddy slope with arrows falling around you like rain and panicked horses running in every direction. An arrow hit him in the shoulder. It didn't penetrate the armor, but the impact was like being hit with a hammer. Guillaume went down again. Another arrow hit him in the back. Another hit his helmet with a sound like a church bell, and suddenly everything was ringing and spinning, and he couldn't tell which way was up. He managed to get to his knees. He saw Lord Bertrand ahead of him, still mounted, trying to rally the other knights for another charge. That's when an arrow hit Lord Bertrand in the throat, right in the gap between his helmet and his breastplate. Lord Bertrand made a horrible gurgling sound and fell from his horse. Guillaume tried to reach him, crawling through the mud and the bodies, but he couldn't get there in time. By the time he reached Lord Bertrand, the man was already dead, blood pooling around him, his eyes staring at nothing. The battle continued for hours, but the outcome was never in doubt. The French kept charging, kept dying, kept accomplishing absolutely nothing except filling the field with bodies. By the time night fell and the fighting finally stopped, the French had lost thousands of men. The English had lost maybe 100. Guillaume survived, but just barely. He spent that night lying in a ditch, too hurt and exhausted to move, listening to the screams of the wounded, the groans of dying men calling for help that would never come. He spent the next day crawling back toward the French lines, dragging his injured shoulder, trying to process what he'd just experienced. This was supposed to be glorious. This was supposed to be what knights did, fighting honorable battles against worthy opponents. Instead, it had been a slaughter, a brutal, efficient massacre carried out by commoners with bows. Everything Guillaume had been taught about warfare, about the superiority of mounted knights, about the code of chivalry and honorable combat, all of it was suddenly revealed to be a lie. Bows and arrows, the weapons of peasants, had just destroyed the finest army France could field. The age of the knight was ending right there in that muddy field at Crécy, and Guillaume had a front-row seat to watch it die. But Guillaume couldn't just go home. He was still bound by his oath of service. Lord Bertrand was dead, but Lord Bertrand's son, Henri, had survived the battle and inherited his father's title.
and Henri expected Guillaume to continue serving the family. So Guillaume stayed with the army, stayed with this nightmare campaign, and watched as things continued to get worse. The next major battle was at Poitiers in 1356, 10 years after Crécy. 10 years of endless fighting, endless campaigns, endless suffering. Guillaume was 42 years old now, ancient by medieval standards, especially for a knight who'd spent his entire adult life getting beaten up for a living.
His body was wrecked. His knees barely worked anymore. His hearing was half gone from too many blows to the helmet. He had scars on top of scars, old injuries that had never healed right, new injuries that kept coming. He couldn't wear his armor for more than a few hours without being in agony. He couldn't ride for more than a day without his back seizing up. But he was still expected to fight. Poitiers was, if anything, even worse than Crécy. The French had learned nothing from their previous defeat. They charged the English position, got shot to pieces by longbowmen, and watched their army collapse in chaos. The French king himself, Jean II, was captured, the most powerful man in France, reduced to a prisoner, held for ransom like a common criminal. Guillaume was captured too, not by being defeated in honorable single combat, but by simply being too exhausted to keep fighting. He surrendered to an English knight who looked barely old enough to shave, some kid who was probably having the time of his life playing at war, and was dragged off to become someone's prisoner. Now, you might think being a prisoner was bad, but here's the thing. If you were a valuable prisoner, if your family could pay a good ransom, you'd actually be treated pretty well. You'd be fed, housed, kept safe until the money arrived. Guillaume was not a valuable prisoner. His family had no money. They'd been struggling even before the plague, and after it, they were barely surviving. There was no way they could afford a ransom, not even a small one. So Guillaume sat in a cell in some English castle, waiting to see what his captors would do with him. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months. He wasn't tortured or mistreated, just forgotten, left to rot in a damp, cold cell with no idea if he'd ever get out. He got sick again, not the plague this time, but some kind of lung infection that left him coughing up blood and fighting for every breath. The English didn't particularly care if he lived or died. He was worthless to them. But Guillaume was too stubborn to die. He'd survived this long, survived wars and plagues and battles and injuries, and he wasn't about to let a cough finish him off. After 8 months, an exchange was arranged. The French and English had negotiated a prisoner swap, trading captive knights back and forth. Guillaume was included in the deal, not because anyone valued him, but because they needed to balance the numbers. So Guillaume went home, or what was left of home anyway. Montfort-sur-Risle was a ghost town. The plague had killed most of the population, and the war had scattered the rest. The castle was half empty, maintained by a skeleton crew of servants. The fields were overgrown. The village was silent. Guillaume found his family's house and discovered his father had died while he was gone. His mother was still alive, barely, living in a house that was falling apart because there was nobody to repair it. His sisters had married and moved away. There was nobody left. Guillaume was 43 years old, broken in body and spirit, with no money, no prospects, and no idea what to do next. He'd spent his entire life being a knight, and what it had gotten him? Pain, poverty, and loss. But you know what the real kick in the teeth was? He was still expected to serve, because he was a knight, because he'd sworn an oath, because that's how the system worked. Young Lord Henri still expected Guillaume to show up when called, to fight in wars, to maintain the facade that everything was fine and the feudal order was intact. So Guillaume kept going. What else could he do? He put on his rusty armor, climbed onto his sway-backed horse, and continued playing the role of a knight, even though the whole concept had become a cruel joke.
You want to know what else sucked about being a knight? The code of chivalry everyone talks about? It was complete garbage. All those noble ideals about protecting the weak and fighting honorably and respecting women, yeah, that was propaganda, a fairy tale told by poets and troubadours who'd never actually been to war. In reality, knights were some of the most brutal, violent people in medieval society. They pillaged villages, burned crops, terrorized peasants. When armies moved through the countryside, they'd strip the land bare, taking everything of value and destroying what they couldn't carry. It was called chevauchée, and it was standard military practice. The idea was to damage your enemy's economy by destroying their resources, but in practice, it meant starving innocent people. Guillaume participated in this. He didn't have a choice. When your lord orders you to burn a village, you burn the village. When you're told to seize food supplies from peasants who are already starving, you seize the food. When you encounter enemy forces and the battle gets messy, you don't stop to worry about civilian casualties. And women? The code of chivalry supposedly demanded that knights treat women with respect and courtesy. The reality was that rape was rampant in wartime. Guillaume saw it happen countless times. He never participated himself, at least that's what he told himself, but he didn't stop it either. He looked the other way. He told himself it wasn't his problem. He added it to the growing list of things he tried not to think about at night. The older Guillaume got, the more he realized that everything he'd believed about knighthood, everything he'd been taught as a boy, was a lie, designed to make him complicit in a system of violence and exploitation. Knights weren't heroes, they were thugs with better equipment.
But if you like hearing about historical truths that shatter your illusions, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Hit that notification bell too, because we're just getting started on destroying everything you thought you knew about medieval times. And throw me a comment letting me know what other historical myths you want me to tackle next. Your engagement helps me keep making these deep dives into the past. Now, let's continue with Guillaume's story, because somehow, incredibly, it still gets worse. The war dragged on. Years turned into decades. Guillaume fought in battles he couldn't remember, in places whose names he forgot. He saw friends die, watched young knights full of enthusiasm get cut down before they'd lived long enough to realize how screwed they were. He got injured so many times he stopped counting. Broken ribs, broken fingers, another concussion, a sword cut across his thigh that got infected and nearly killed him. By the time Guillaume was 50, he looked 70. His hair was white. His face was a map of scars. He walked with a pronounced limp from all the damage to his knees and hips. His hands shook from nerve damage. He had nightmares every single night, dreams where he was back at Crécy, back at Poitiers, back in any one of 100 different hells he'd survived. Modern doctors would call it PTSD. Medieval people called it being melancholic and figured it was just what happened to old soldiers. Guillaume tried to retire. He went to Lord Henri and explained that he simply couldn't do this anymore, that his body was giving out, that he'd served faithfully for over 30 years and deserved to be released from his obligations. Lord Henri laughed at him, told Guillaume that he'd serve until he was dead or physically incapable of holding a sword, whichever came first. Told him that this was what it meant to be a knight, to serve unto death, and that Guillaume should be honored to continue serving the family. So Guillaume continued. He had no choice. But here's something interesting that happened around this time. The nature of warfare was changing. Those longbowmen at Crécy, that was just the beginning. Armies were starting to use cannon, primitive gunpowder weapons that were unreliable and dangerous, but terrifyingly effective. Crossbows were becoming more common, weapons that could punch through plate armor with ease and could be used by anyone with minimal training. The whole feudal military system, the idea that warfare was the domain of trained knights, was becoming obsolete. You didn't need years of expensive training to fire a crossbow.
You didn't need a fancy horse and expensive armor to operate a cannon. Commoners could now kill knights with ease, and there wasn't a damn thing the knights could do about it. Guillaume watched this transition happen in real time. He watched as lords started hiring mercenary companies instead of relying on their feudal vassals. He watched as professional soldiers, men who fought for money rather than honor or obligation, became the new standard. He watched as knights became increasingly irrelevant on the battlefield. And you know what? Guillaume was relieved, because if knights were becoming obsolete, maybe that meant he could finally stop. Maybe that meant the system would change and he could escape. He was wrong, of course. The feudal system didn't end just because it stopped making military sense. It continued because too many powerful people had too much invested in maintaining it. Lords kept their knights around for prestige, for tradition, for the illusion of power, and knights like Guillaume were trapped, bound by oaths and obligations and debts they could never repay. Guillaume was 55 when the next disaster struck. The war with England had finally ended, at least temporarily. The Treaty of Bretigny in 1360 brought a pause to the fighting. Guillaume thought he might finally have some peace. Instead, France descended into chaos. You see, all those mercenary companies that had been hired to fight the English, they didn't just go home when the war ended. They kept roaming the countryside, now as bandits, taking what they wanted because they had armies and nobody could stop them. These groups, called free companies or routiers, were made up of professional soldiers from all over Europe, men who knew nothing but war and had no interest in finding honest work.
And they were everywhere. Guillaume's region was overrun by a free company led by an English knight named Sir Robert Knowles. Sir Robert and his men descended on the area like locusts, demanding food and money and lodging from every village and castle they came across. Those who resisted were burned out. Those who couldn't pay were robbed of everything they had. Lord Henri gathered his remaining knights, including Guillaume, and tried to negotiate with Sir Robert. The meeting was held in neutral territory, in an open field, with both sides bringing a dozen armed men. Guillaume stood behind Lord Henri, wearing his battered armor, holding a sword that was older than some of the men around him. Sir Robert arrived with his own retinue, men who looked well-fed and well-equipped, men who'd been making a killing, literally and figuratively, off the chaos in France. Lord Henri demanded that Sir Robert leave the region. Sir Robert laughed and demanded payment for leaving. Lord Henri refused. Sir Robert shrugged and said, "Then we'll take what we want." And that's exactly what they did. For the next 2 years, Sir Robert's company terrorized the region. They'd show up at a village, demand tribute, and burn it down if they didn't get what they wanted. They'd ambush travelers on the roads. They'd attack small castles and fortifications, overwhelming defenders through sheer numbers. Guillaume fought them when he could, which wasn't often. He was too old, too slow, too broken. But he tried. He helped defend villages, helped organize local resistance, tried to be the thing he'd always been told knights were supposed to be, protectors of the weak. It didn't matter. Sir Robert's men were professionals, and they were ruthless. They won almost every engagement, and Guillaume watched as everything he'd spent his life supposedly protecting was destroyed. The final blow came when Sir Robert's company attacked Lord Henri's castle. They didn't have siege equipment, but they didn't need it. They just surrounded the place and waited, cut off the food supply, cut off the water supply, and waited for starvation to do the work. Guillaume was inside during the siege. He watched as the supplies dwindled, as people started eating rats and leather, as the children began to die from malnutrition. He watched as Lord Henri, the man he'd served for decades, slowly starved to death because he refused to surrender his castle to brigands. When the end came, it wasn't glorious. Lord Henri didn't die in combat. He died in his bed, too weak to stand, his body consuming itself from the inside out. And when he died, the remaining defenders finally surrendered. Sir Robert's men looted everything. They took the silver, the weapons, the food that had been carefully rationed.
They took the horses, including Guillaume's last war horse, the one companion who'd been with him through the final years of his career. They took everything of value and left the survivors with nothing. Guillaume walked out of that castle at 57 years old, with literally nothing to his name except the rusty armor on his back and a sword he could barely lift anymore. His lord was dead, his family was dead, his youth, his health, his entire life had been consumed by a system that gave him nothing in return except pain and poverty. And you want to know the worst part? He still thought of himself as a knight, still held on to that identity even though it meant nothing anymore. Because what else did he have? Being a knight was the only thing Guillaume had ever been, the only thing he knew how to be. Take that away, and what was left? Nothing. There was nothing left. Guillaume spent his final years as what they called a knight-errant, which is a fancy term for a homeless person with a sword. He wandered from place to place, sometimes finding work as a guard or a mercenary, sometimes just begging for food and shelter. His armor fell apart piece by piece, and he couldn't afford to replace it. His sword got duller and more notched with every fight. His body continued to break down until he could barely walk some days. He died at 61, which was actually pretty old for a medieval knight. He died alone in a barn somewhere in Burgundy, probably from pneumonia or maybe just from his body finally giving up after decades of abuse. Nobody mourned him. Nobody remembered him. He was just another dead knight, one of thousands who'd lived and died in obscurity, ground up by a system that valued them only as long as they could fight.
And that's the real story of medieval knights. Not the fairy tale of noble warriors and heroic deeds, but the brutal reality of men trapped in system that used them up and threw them away. Men who spent their entire lives in pain, in debt, fighting wars they didn't understand, for causes they didn't believe in, all in service to lords who saw them as disposable assets. But Guillaume's story, as depressing as it is, actually helps us understand why being a knight genuinely sucked. So let's break down all the different ways these guys had it rough, because we've really only scratched the surface. First, let's talk about the economics of knighthood, because this is something that gets glossed over in most retellings of medieval history. Being a knight was expensive, like insanely, bankruptingly expensive. We mentioned earlier that a full suit of armor could cost as much as a small village earned in a year. Let's put that in modern terms. A good suit of plate armor in the 15th century cost about 200 florins. A skilled craftsman might earn about 30 florins per year. So we're talking about roughly 6 to 7 years of wages for a skilled worker. In today's money, that's like spending $300,000 on a suit. And that's just the armor. You also needed weapons, multiple weapons actually. A sword, which was expensive and required constant maintenance, a lance, which broke constantly and needed to be replaced, a mace or warhammer for close combat, daggers, always multiple daggers, and all of these weapons needed to be high quality because your life literally depended on them not breaking at a critical moment. Then there were the horses. Oh boy, the horses. A good war horse could cost as much as the armor. These weren't normal horses, remember. They were specially bred, specially trained animals, massive and aggressive and temperamental. They required constant care, special feed, and they were always getting injured or sick. And you couldn't just have one horse. You needed at least 3 horses, one for battle, one for travel, and one to carry your equipment. Some knights had 5 or 6 horses, just to make sure they always had backups. And we haven't even gotten to the human costs yet. If you were a full knight, you were expected to have a squire. The squire needed to be fed, clothed, and equipped. You might also have servants, grooms to care for the horses, maybe a page or 2. All of these people needed to be paid and fed and housed. So, let's do some medieval math here. Armor, 200 florins. Weapons, maybe 50 florins. Horses, 200 florins for a war horse, maybe 50 each for regular horses, so another 300 florins total.
Add in the costs of maintaining all this stuff, feeding and paying your people, and you're looking at an initial investment of around 600 to 700 florins, plus ongoing costs of maybe 50 to 100 florins per year. How did knights afford this? Well, if you were the son of a wealthy noble, you didn't have to worry about it. Your family paid for everything. But if you were a minor nobleman, like Guillaume, you went into debt. Massive, crippling debt that you'd spend your entire life trying to pay off. And how did you pay it off? By fighting, by winning tournaments and collecting prize money, by capturing enemy knights and ransoming them, by serving your lord and hoping he'd reward you with land or money, by essentially gambling your life over and over again, hoping you'd get lucky and make enough money to cover your costs. Most knights never made it. They lived their entire lives in debt, one bad tournament or one unsuccessful campaign away from complete financial ruin. And if they got seriously injured and couldn't fight anymore, they were screwed. There was no disability insurance in the Middle Ages. If you couldn't fulfill your military obligations, you lost your status, your land, everything. The feudal system was supposed to protect knights, to give them security in exchange for their service. In practice, it was a pyramid scheme where the people at the top got rich and the people at the bottom got ground to paste. Now, let's talk about the physical reality of being a knight, because the human body was not designed to do what these guys did. Start with the armor. 70 pounds of steel distributed across your entire body. Now, people will tell you that armor was well balanced and that knights could move easily in it, and that's sort of true. A well-fitted suit of plate armor distributed the weight reasonably well, and knights could indeed move, run, even do acrobatics in their armor. But here's what people don't tell you. Wearing 70 pounds of anything for hours at a time is exhausting. Your muscles are constantly working to support that weight. Your joints are under constant stress. And in combat, when you're moving quickly, fighting, swinging weapons, the weight multiplies. Every motion takes more energy. You fatigue faster. Your reaction time slows.
And the heat. Oh my God, the heat. Imagine wearing a steel oven in the middle of summer, because that's essentially what armor was. There was no ventilation. The metal absorbed heat from the sun and radiated it back at you. Knights regularly suffered from heat exhaustion and heat stroke. They'd literally cook inside their own armor on hot days. Then there was the cold. In winter, that same metal that trapped heat in summer would suck the warmth right out of your body. Knights would layer padding underneath, wear extra clothes, but it didn't help much. Frostbite was common. Hypothermia was common. And if you fell into water while wearing armor, you drowned. The weight would pull you straight to the bottom, and there was no way to remove the armor quickly enough to save yourself. The physical toll of combat was equally brutal. Every fight, every tournament, every training session was an opportunity for injury. Broken bones were routine. Concussions were routine. Cuts, bruises, sprains, dislocations, all routine. And remember, this was before modern medicine. There were no antibiotics, no painkillers stronger than alcohol or maybe some herbal remedies that barely worked. If you got injured, you just had to tough it out and hope it healed on its own. Infection was the real killer. A minor wound could easily become infected, and once infection set in, there wasn't much medieval doctors could do. They'd try bleeding you, which didn't help. They'd try applying various poultices and ointments, most of which did nothing or made things worse. They'd pray, and if you were really unlucky, they'd amputate, sawing off infected limbs with saws meant for cutting wood. No anesthesia, except maybe some wine to numb the pain, and a cauterizing iron to seal the wound, which hurt worse than the amputation itself. Knights lived with chronic pain as a baseline. Their bodies were covered in old injuries that ached in cold weather. Their joints were arthritic from the constant stress. Their backs were destroyed from years of riding and fighting. By the time a knight reached 40, he was typically in worse physical shape than a modern 80-year-old. And the head injuries. We need to talk about the head injuries, because knights got hit in the head a lot. Helmets protected your skull from being split open, but they didn't protect your brain from being rattled around inside your skull. Every solid hit to the helmet was a concussion, and knights took hundreds, maybe thousands of these hits over the course of their careers. The cumulative effect of repeated concussions is devastating. Memory problems, mood swings, difficulty concentrating, increased aggression, depression, all symptoms of what we now know as chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Medieval knights displayed all of these symptoms, but people just thought it was normal, thought it was just what happened when men got older. Modern studies of medieval skeletons have revealed just how damaged these guys were. Knights' bones show evidence of multiple fractures, many of which healed poorly. Their spines are compressed and damaged from years of wearing armor and riding horses. Their joints show advanced arthritis. Some skeletons show evidence of surgical procedures, crude attempts to drill holes in skulls to relieve pressure or to set broken bones. Being a knight meant accepting that your body was going to be destroyed. It was just a question of how fast and how badly. But you know what might be even worse than the physical trauma? The psychological trauma. Because knights saw some truly horrific things, and they had no way to process or deal with it. Medieval warfare was brutal in ways that are hard to overstate. There were no Geneva Conventions, no rules of engagement, no concept of war crimes. When cities were besieged and captured, the inhabitants were often massacred. Men, women, children, didn't matter. The attacking army would just kill everyone, partly as punishment, partly to terrorize other cities into surrendering, partly just because soldiers were brutal, and violence begets more violence. Knights participated in these massacres. They watched them happen. They lived with the memories of burning villages, of children begging for mercy, of mass graves filled with civilians who'd done nothing wrong except be in the wrong place at the wrong time.
And there was no therapy, no counseling, no support systems for dealing with trauma. Knights were expected to just deal with it, to be tough, to not show weakness. If you broke down, if you couldn't handle it, you were seen as a coward, as less than a man. So, knights drank. They drank a lot. Alcohol was the main coping mechanism for dealing with trauma, and alcoholism was rampant among the warrior class. Knights would go on benders that lasted days, drinking themselves into oblivion to try to forget what they'd seen and done. Some knights turned to religion, spending hours in prayer, trying to find forgiveness for their sins. Some became more violent, channeling their trauma into aggression, becoming the kind of brutal thugs that terrorized the countryside. Some just broke, becoming withdrawn and non-functional, the medieval equivalent of a soldier with severe PTSD. And here's something that doesn't get talked about much: suicide. It's hard to know how common suicide was among knights, because medieval records rarely mention it. Suicide was considered a mortal sin in Christian theology, so families would often cover it up, claiming the person died of illness or accident. But there are hints in the records, stories of knights who seemed to deliberately seek death in battle, who took unnecessary risks, who charged into situations where survival was impossible. Were they being brave, or were they just trying to end their suffering in a way that would preserve their honor? We'll never know for sure, but it's worth considering. If you're still with me at this point, and I hope you are because this story only gets more fascinating, do me a favor and drop a like on this video. Let me know in the comments what aspect of medieval life you want me to explore next. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? We've got so much more historical misery to explore together. Now, let's talk about something that really drove home how much being a knight sucked: the code of chivalry. You've heard of chivalry, right? It's held up as this noble code of conduct, this set of ideals that guided knightly behavior: protect the weak, fight honorably, respect women, serve God and king, be brave, be loyal, be virtuous. It all sounds great. The reality was that chivalry was mostly bullshit, a propaganda tool used by the church and nobility to control knights and make them seem less like the violent thugs they actually were. The code of chivalry was codified in various texts throughout the medieval period, most famously in works like the Song of Roland and various Arthurian legends. These texts portrayed knights as paragons of virtue,
as men who lived by a sacred code, and knights were expected to at least pretend to live up to these ideals, to maintain the fiction that they were noble warriors rather than professional killers. But here's the thing about ideals. They're really easy to espouse and really hard to actually live by, especially if living by them could get you killed. Take the idea of fighting honorably. What does that even mean in the context of medieval warfare? Are you supposed to give your enemy a fair chance? Because if you do that, you're probably going to die. Real combat isn't a gentleman's duel. It's brutal, chaotic, and the only rule is survive. Knights who tried to fight honorably ended up dead. Knights who survived were the ones who'd do whatever it took to win. Honor be damned. Or consider the idea of protecting the weak. That sounds noble, until you realize that knights were often the ones oppressing the weak in the first place. Knights extracted taxes and labor from peasants. Knights burned villages and destroyed crops as military tactics. Knights participated in massacres. How can you be the protector when you're also the threat? The cognitive dissonance was real, and knights dealt with it in different ways. Some just ignored it, accepting that there was a gap between the ideal and the reality, and not worrying about it too much. Some tried to compartmentalize, telling themselves that they were following orders, that they were doing what was necessary, that the ends justified the means. Some genuinely tried to live up to the ideals, and were constantly disappointed in themselves and others when they fell short.
And the respect women part? That's particularly laughable. Yes, there was a whole tradition of courtly love, where knights were supposed to worship noble ladies from afar, write them poetry, fight in their honor, but that was a game played by the upper classes, a social ritual that had nothing to do with actual respect for women. In reality, women had almost no rights in medieval society. They were property, first of their fathers, then of their husbands. They couldn't own land in their own names, couldn't make legal decisions, couldn't control their own lives. And knights, despite all their supposed chivalrous ideals, were often the ones enforcing this system. Rape was common in wartime, as we mentioned before, but it was also common in peacetime. Sexual assault by noblemen, including knights, was rarely punished. If a knight raped a peasant woman, who was going to stop him? The woman had no recourse, no way to seek justice. And if a knight raped a noble woman, that was taken more seriously, but mainly because it was seen as an offense against her male relatives, a violation of their property, not as a crime against the woman herself. The code of chivalry was a fantasy, a set of ideals that had little connection to how knights actually behaved. And knights knew this. They lived with the knowledge that they were supposed to be something they weren't, supposed to embody virtues they didn't possess. It was yet another source of psychological stress, another way the system ground them down. But let's move on to another aspect of knightly life that really sucked: the tournaments. I mentioned tournaments earlier, but we should really dive into what these events were actually like, because they were nothing like the sanitized versions you see in movies. Early medieval tournaments, the ones happening in the 11th and 12th centuries, were basically just organized melees. Two groups of knights would meet in an open field and beat the hell out of each other. These events were incredibly dangerous. Knights died regularly. Horses died even more regularly. There were minimal rules, and those that existed were often ignored in the heat of battle. The goal was to capture enemy knights and ransom them, just like in real warfare. So knights would be trying to knock each other off their horses, grab them, drag them away from their comrades, all while avoiding being captured themselves. It was chaotic, violent, and utterly exhausting. And expensive. So expensive. You had to pay an entry fee to participate. You had to maintain your equipment, which took a beating during the tournament. If your horse got injured or killed, you had to replace it. If you lost, you might have to pay ransom or surrender your equipment to the victor. If you won, you might gain some prize money and captured equipment, but you also had to split your winnings with your lord and your retinue. For knights like Guillaume, tournaments were a gamble. Win, and you might make enough money to cover your costs and have a little left over. Lose, and you'd go deeper into debt. And even if you won, the physical toll was immense. Broken bones, concussions, injuries that might take weeks or months to heal. Later tournaments, in the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, became more structured and slightly less dangerous. The joust became the main event, a one-on-one competition where knights would charge at each other with lances, trying to knock their opponent off their horse. This was still incredibly dangerous, but at least it was controlled. There were officials, rules, safety equipment like blunted lances and specialized armor. But jousting was still dangerous as hell. The impact of two mounted knights colliding at high speed was tremendous. Lances would shatter, sending wooden splinters everywhere. Knights would be thrown from their horses with tremendous force. Helmets would be dented or punctured. Necks would be broken from the whiplash. There are recorded cases of lance splinters going through helmet visors and killing the knight instantly. There are cases of knights being paralyzed from jousting injuries. There are cases of knights being trampled by their own horses after being unhorsed. And here's the thing. Knights had to participate in these events. It wasn't optional. Your reputation as a knight depended on your tournament performance. If you didn't compete, or if you competed and did poorly, you'd be seen as weak, cowardly, not worthy of your spurs. Your lord would be embarrassed, your peers would mock you, your chances of making advantageous marriages or alliances would diminish. So knights would compete even when injured, even when they couldn't afford it, even when they knew it was stupid and dangerous. But not competing was worse than competing and losing. Tournaments were also breeding grounds for feuds and violence that extended beyond the tournament field. Knights with grudges would use tournaments as opportunities to legally hurt or kill their enemies. You could couch your lance just right, aim for a gap in the armor and make it look like an accident. You could use a mace with a little too much enthusiasm in the melee. You could make sure your opponent's horse got spooked at just the right moment.
And the crowd loved it, because tournaments were entertainment, the medieval equivalent of blood sport. People would come from miles around to watch knights beat each other up. They'd gamble on the outcomes, they'd cheer for their favorites, they'd jeer at the losers. The more violent and dramatic the action, the more the crowd enjoyed it. For the knights, though, it was just another day at the office, another chance to get maimed or killed in front of a cheering crowd. Now, let's talk about the religious aspect of being a knight, because this added yet another layer of psychological complexity to an already impossible situation. Knights were supposed to be Christian warriors, soldiers of God, defenders of the faith. The church heavily promoted this idea, creating the concept of the Miles Christi, the soldier of Christ. Knights were told that their martial skills were gifts from God to be used in his service. Fighting heathens and heretics wasn't just acceptable, it was a holy duty. This culminated in the Crusades, which were essentially military campaigns blessed by the Pope, with the promise that any knight who participated would receive forgiveness for his sins. Go to the Holy Land, kill some Muslims, and get a free pass to heaven. It was a hell of a sales pitch. Thousands of knights signed up for the Crusades. Some genuinely believed they were doing God's work. Some were looking for adventure and glory. Some were hoping to escape debts or legal problems back home. Some just wanted to loot wealthy Middle Eastern cities. The reality of the Crusades was predictably horrific. The First Crusade in 1096 was marked by massacres of Jews in Europe before the Crusaders even reached the Holy Land. When they finally captured Jerusalem in 1099, they killed pretty much everyone in the city, Muslims and Jews alike, in a bloodbath that lasted days. Subsequent crusades were no better. The Fourth Crusade in 1204 didn't even make it to the Holy Land. The Crusaders got distracted and ended up sacking Constantinople, a Christian city, killing thousands of fellow Christians and destroying priceless religious artifacts. So much for being soldiers of God. For the individual knights involved, the Crusades were a nightmare. They had to travel thousands of miles, often on foot, because their horses died along the way. They had to fight in unfamiliar terrain and climate. They faced enemies who were better adapted to the environment and often better organized. They got sick from diseases they'd never encountered before. They starved when supply lines broke down. They died in huge numbers, not usually from combat, but from dysentery, heat stroke, dehydration, and exhaustion. And even if they survived, even if they made it home,
They had to live with what they'd done. They had to reconcile their actions with their faith. They'd been told they were serving God, but they'd participated in atrocities. They'd killed civilians. They'd looted churches. They'd done things that no loving God would condone. Some knights dealt with this by doubling down on their faith, convincing themselves that everything they'd done was justified because it was in service to God. Some became more brutal, figuring that if they were already damned, they might as well embrace it. Some had crises of faith, questioning everything they'd been taught. And some knights joined military religious orders, organizations like the Knights Templar or the Knights Hospitallers, trying to find some way to serve both God and their martial calling. These orders were supposed to be the pinnacle of Christian knighthood, combining military skill with monastic discipline. In reality, military orders could be just as corrupt and brutal as secular knights. The Templars became incredibly wealthy and powerful, running what was essentially an international banking operation. They were more interested in money and politics than in serving God. The order was eventually suppressed in the early 13th century, with many Templars arrested, tortured, and executed on charges of heresy. The whole religious aspect of knighthood was yet another source of cognitive dissonance. Knights were supposed to be humble servants of God, but they were also supposed to be proud warriors who sought glory and honor. They were supposed to turn the other cheek, but also to violently defend their honor at the slightest insult. They were supposed to love their enemies, but also to kill them efficiently. It was an impossible set of contradictory expectations, and it messed with knights' heads in ways that are hard to understand today. Let's shift gears and talk about the domestic life of knights, because we've been focusing so much on combat and warfare that we haven't really addressed what their home lives were like. And spoiler alert, they sucked too.
If you were a successful knight, wealthy enough to have your own estate, you'd spend a lot of time managing that estate. And medieval estate management was a constant headache. You had to oversee the peasants working your land, make sure they were planting the right crops, make sure they were paying their taxes and rents. You had to deal with disputes between peasants, acting as judge in local courts. You had to maintain the physical infrastructure of your estate, repairing buildings, managing forests, overseeing mills and other facilities. This was all tedious, time-consuming work that had nothing to do with the martial skills you'd spent your whole life developing. Most knights hated this aspect of their lives. They'd been trained to fight, not to be bureaucrats and accountants. But it had to be done, because if you didn't manage your estate properly, you'd lose money and status. And then there was family life. Knights typically married for political or economic reasons, not for love. Marriages were arranged to create alliances between families, to consolidate land holdings, to secure financial resources. You might meet your future spouse once or twice before the wedding, or you might not meet them at all until the wedding day. These arranged marriages were hit or miss. Sometimes couples would grow to genuinely care for each other over time. Sometimes they'd maintain a cordial, business-like relationship. Sometimes they'd absolutely despise each other, but be stuck together because divorce was nearly impossible in medieval Christian society. Knights were often away from home for extended periods, off fighting wars or attending tournaments or serving at their lord's court. This meant their wives were left to manage the estate in their absence, which created its own set of tensions. The wife would make decisions, establish routines, build relationships with the peasants and servants. Then the knight would come home and want to reassert his authority, overturning decisions his wife had made, creating conflict. And let's talk about the children. Knights were expected to produce heirs, especially male heirs, who could inherit the family land and title. But child mortality was incredibly high in the Middle Ages. Even in noble families with access to the best available care, it was common for half or more of children to die before reaching adulthood. Infections, fevers, childhood illnesses that we don't even think about anymore. And there was nothing they could do except pray and hope. No antibiotics, no vaccines, no modern medicine, just prayer and hope, and watching your child suffer and die.
The psychological impact of losing child after child was devastating. Some knights became hardened to it, viewing child death as just a normal part of life. Some became deeply religious, seeking comfort in faith. Some became withdrawn and emotionally distant from their remaining children, trying to protect themselves from future pain. And the children who did survive? As we saw with Guillaume, they'd often be sent away at a young age to serve as pages in other households. This was considered normal, a necessary part of a young nobleman's education. But it meant that knights had very little relationship with their own children. They'd send their kids away at 7 or 8 years old, then see them occasionally over the next decade or so. Then suddenly the kid would be an adult and a stranger. Some knights regretted this. They'd see their sons making the same mistakes they had made, suffering the same hardships, and they couldn't do anything about it because they'd given up the right to raise their own children. Other knights were fine with it, viewing it as just how things were done. The point is, knights didn't have happy, fulfilling family lives. They had complicated, often painful relationships shaped by a system that valued political alliances and economic considerations over personal happiness or emotional well-being. Now, I want to take a moment to talk about something that's going to sound really obvious, but needs to be said. Medieval people were just as human as we are. They had the same emotional needs, the same desires for happiness and love and fulfillment, the same capacity for suffering. The difference is that they lived in a society that didn't give a damn about their emotional well-being.
Modern soldiers who develop PTSD can seek treatment. Medieval knights just had to live with it. Modern people in unhappy marriages can get divorced. Medieval knights were stuck. Modern workers who hate their jobs can quit. Medieval knights were bound by oaths they couldn't break without losing their honor and status. The medieval world was brutal in ways that go beyond just the physical violence. It was psychologically and emotionally brutal, a world where people's feelings and needs were systematically ignored in favor of maintaining social order and hierarchy. And knights, despite their relatively privileged position in that society, were still trapped in that system. Maybe even more trapped than others because they had more to lose. A peasant could run away, could disappear into another village and start a new life. A knight couldn't do that. Their identity, their status, their entire sense of self was tied up in being a knight. Abandon that, and what were you? Before we go further, I want to remind you that if you're finding this deep dive into historical reality fascinating, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. We've got so many more stories like this, stories that reveal the uncomfortable truths behind the myths. Hit that subscribe button, leave a comment telling me what historical topic you want me to tackle next, and give this video a like if you appreciate content that doesn't sugarcoat the past. Your support helps me keep making these in-depth explorations. Now, let's talk about something that really exemplifies how awful being a knight could be: the concept of chevauché warfare. Chevauché was a military tactic that basically involved riding through enemy territory and destroying everything. You'd burn crops, slaughter livestock, demolish villages, and generally make the land unusable. The idea was to damage your enemy's economy and ability to wage war by destroying their resources. In practice, it meant that knights spent a lot of their time terrorizing civilians. Imagine you're a knight and your lord orders you to participate in a chevauché. You ride into enemy territory with your fellow knights and soldiers. You come to a village. The peasants living there have done nothing to you personally. They're just trying to survive, grow their crops, raise their families. They're probably not even sure what the war is about or who's fighting whom. And you burn their village. You destroy their crops. You kill their livestock. Maybe you kill some of them too if they resist, or if you're in a particularly bad mood. Then you move on to the next village and do it again. This wasn't rare. This wasn't an unusual wartime atrocity. This was standard operating procedure.
Chevauché was considered a legitimate military tactic, used by everyone from petty lords to kings. The most famous example is probably the English chevauchés during the 100 Years' War. Edward, the Black Prince, led devastating campaigns through France, destroying thousands of villages and farms. The French responded with their own chevauchés. Both sides devastated the French countryside, deliberately starving the civilian population. For the knights participating in these campaigns, it must have been soul-crushing. This wasn't glorious combat against worthy opponents. This was bullying and terrorizing people who couldn't fight back. Even the knights who'd convinced themselves they were noble warriors had to know on some level that what they were doing was indefensible. Some knights tried to rationalize it. They'd tell themselves the enemy peasants were supporting enemy soldiers, so destroying their resources was legitimate. They'd tell themselves this was just how war worked, that it wasn't personal. They'd tell themselves they were just following orders. Sound familiar? It should. These are the same rationalizations that soldiers have used throughout history to justify atrocities. The human mind is really good at finding ways to make terrible actions seem acceptable, especially when everyone around you is doing the same thing. But those rationalizations only go so far. Deep down, knights knew they were doing something wrong, and they had to live with that knowledge, had to carry the weight of all those burned villages and killed innocents. Let's talk about a specific historical example to make this more concrete. During the 100 Years' War, there was a French knight named Bertrand du Guesclin. He's actually remembered as a hero in French history, a great military leader who helped turn the tide against the English. And he was effective, no doubt about it. But let's look at what his effectiveness actually meant.
Du Guesclin's strategy involved avoiding large set-piece battles, instead using guerrilla tactics and strategic devastation of territory. He'd let the English win battles, then starve them out by destroying the countryside around them. He'd isolate English-held castles, then force them to surrender through attrition. This worked, but it meant that Du Guesclin was deliberately destroying French territory, starving French peasants, making French lands uninhabitable. He was waging war against his own people as much as against the English. And the thing is, Du Guesclin is one of the good guys in French historical memory. He's celebrated as a national hero. If this is what the heroes did, imagine what the villains were like. The point I'm making here is that there was no escaping the moral compromises of knighthood. Even the most celebrated, successful knights were participating in actions that were, by any reasonable standard, horrific, and they all had to find ways to live with that. Now let's shift topics again and talk about the training regime that knights went through, because we touched on this earlier but didn't really dig into the details. A page, as we mentioned, started training around age 7. The initial training was basic, learning to ride, learning to handle weapons, building strength and endurance. But as the boy got older, the training became more intense and specialized. Sword training was particularly brutal. You'd practice strikes and parries for hours until your arms were screaming and you could barely lift the sword anymore. Then you'd practice some more. You'd practice against stationary targets, against moving targets, against other students. You'd practice until the movements became automatic, until you could react without thinking. But here's the thing. Swords are heavy. A medieval longsword weighed about 3 to 4 pounds, which doesn't sound like much until you're swinging it for hours at a time. Your forearms would burn, your shoulders would ache, your grip would start to fail, and if your form started to slip, you'd get hit by your instructor or by the student you were sparring with. Lance training was even worse. A jousting lance weighed anywhere from 10 to 15 pounds and was about 12 feet long. Now imagine holding that lance steady while riding a horse at full gallop, trying to hit a small target. It requires immense upper body strength and incredible balance. Pages and squires would practice with quintains, which were rotating targets mounted on posts. You'd ride at the quintain with your lance, try to hit the target squarely. If you hit it wrong,
The quintain would spin around and knock you off your horse. Getting hit by a rotating quintain hurt like hell and was incredibly embarrassing. They'd also practice mounted combat against each other, using blunted weapons, but still hitting hard enough to leave bruises and occasionally break bones. Training injuries were constant. Most knights and squires were walking around with some kind of injury at any given time. And the physical training was relentless. Running, climbing, wrestling, swimming in armor to build strength and endurance. They do exercises that would make modern athletes cry. All of this while still growing, still developing physically. The training was designed to push young bodies to their limits and beyond. The result was that knights who survived this training were incredibly skilled and physically impressive. They could perform feats that seem almost superhuman today. There are accounts of knights in full armor doing backflips, scaling walls, fighting for hours without rest. But the cost was high. The training damaged growing bodies, created injuries that would never fully heal, and traumatized young minds. Remember, these were children and teenagers being put through what amounts to brutal military conditioning, and not everyone survived the training. Some boys died from training injuries, some were permanently disabled, some washed out, unable to handle the physical or psychological demands, and were sent home in disgrace. The ones who made it through were tough, skilled, and utterly broken in ways they wouldn't fully realize until years later.
Let's talk now about the actual mechanics of medieval combat, because I think understanding how knights fought helps explain why their lives were so miserable. First, forget everything you've seen in movies. Movie sword fights are choreographed dances designed to look exciting and dramatic. Real medieval combat was nothing like that. Real sword fighting was short, brutal, and exhausting. Most fights lasted maybe a minute or two before someone was seriously injured or dead. There was no dramatic back and forth, no witty banter, no dramatic poses. Just two or more people trying to kill each other as quickly and efficiently as possible. In armor, sword fighting was even more constrained. Your mobility was limited. Your vision was limited to what you could see through your visor. Your hearing was muffled by your helmet. You were hot, sweating, breathing hard through the small breathing holes in your faceplate. The strategy was to try to find gaps in your opponent's armor, the joints, the armpits, the inside of the elbow, the groin, the visor slit. These were the vulnerable points, and both fighters would be trying to exploit them while protecting their own. Alternatively, you'd try to deliver such powerful blows that you'd injure your opponent through their armor, using the armor to transfer blunt force trauma to their body. Hit someone hard enough in the helmet, you might knock them unconscious. Hit him hard enough in the chest, you might break ribs or damage internal organs. Or you'd try to grapple to get close enough that swords became useless, then switch to daggers for close-in fighting. Medieval knights were trained extensively in wrestling and grappling techniques specifically for this purpose. You'd grab your opponent, try to throw them to the ground, then either stab them with a dagger or bash their head against the ground until they stopped moving. It was brutal, exhausting, and terrifying. And that's just one-on-one combat. In an actual battle, you'd be fighting multiple opponents while also trying to avoid being surrounded, trying to stay with your allies, trying not to get trampled by horses or hit by stray arrows. The chaos of medieval battle is hard to overstate. Imagine hundreds or thousands of men, all in armor, all fighting in a relatively small space. The noise is deafening. You can't see much through your visor. You can't hear commands over the din of combat. You don't know if you're winning or losing. You don't know if the man next to you is a friend or an enemy until you're close enough to see his colors. And you're exhausted. Fighting in armor burns energy at an incredible rate. Within minutes, you're gasping for breath, your muscles are burning, and you're considering how wonderful it would be to just lie down for a moment. But you can't lie down, because if you fall, you might not get back up. You might get trampled, you might get stabbed by someone you never even saw. So you keep fighting, keep swinging your sword, keep trying to stay on your feet and stay alive for just one more minute, and then one more minute after that. Knights who survived battles often described a kind of fugue state,
where they'd fight for hours without really being conscious of what they were doing. Their training would take over, their bodies moving automatically while their minds went somewhere else. It was the only way to cope with the horror and the exhaustion. And after the battle, assuming you survived, you'd have to deal with the aftermath. The adrenaline would wear off, and suddenly you'd become aware of your injuries. Maybe you'd been hit and didn't even notice during the fight. Now the pain would crashing in. You'd look around at the field of dead and dying men. Some of them would be your friends, people you'd trained with, fought alongside, known for years. Some of them would be enemy knights who you might have faced in tournaments, who you might have drunk with at feasts. Now they were just corpses, or worse, wounded men screaming for help that might never come. The battlefield after a fight was hell. Wounded men crying out for water, for help, for their mothers. Scavengers, both human and animal, moving among the bodies, stripping them of anything valuable. The smell of blood and shit and death, so thick you could taste it. And you'd have to help clean up, help identify bodies, help collect your lord's dead for burial, help dispatch enemy wounded who were too far gone to save. This wasn't someone else's job. This was part of being a knight. No wonder so many knights drank themselves into oblivion whenever they got the chance. No wonder so many became brutal and callous. No wonder so many broke under the weight of it all.
We need to talk about something that's been mentioned in passing but deserves its own focus: the economic reality of late medieval knighthood, especially as the system started breaking down in the 14th and 15th centuries. The Black Death, which we talked about earlier, fundamentally changed the economic landscape of Europe. With so many people dead, labor became valuable in a way it never been before. Peasants could demand higher wages, better treatment. They could leave their lord's lands and find work elsewhere. The rigid feudal hierarchy started to crack. For knights, this was a disaster. Their income depended on peasant labor, on rents and taxes collected from the people working their lands. When peasants started demanding more or leaving altogether, knights' incomes plummeted. At the same time, warfare was becoming more expensive. Armor was getting more sophisticated and more costly. Gunpowder weapons were being introduced, requiring new types of equipment and training. Professional armies were replacing feudal levies, and knights who wanted to remain relevant had to compete with trained professional soldiers who fought for wages rather than honor. Many knights found themselves in an impossible situation. They couldn't afford to maintain their equipment and status, but they couldn't abandon knighthood without losing everything. So they went deeper and deeper into debt, borrowing money they'd never be able to repay, trying to maintain a lifestyle that was no longer sustainable. Some knights turned to banditry. They'd rob travelers, extort money from villages, basically become the medieval equivalent of organized crime. These were men who'd been trained since childhood to fight, who had expensive military equipment, and who had no other way to make money. So they used their skills and equipment to prey on civilians. Others became mercenaries, selling their services to whoever would pay. The late Middle Ages saw the rise of mercenary companies, bands of professional soldiers who'd fight for anyone if the price was right. Many of these mercenaries were knights who couldn't make ends meet any other way. And some knights just gave up. They'd sell off their equipment, abandon their lands, and try to find some other way to survive. Maybe they'd become stewards or administrators for wealthier nobles. Maybe they'd enter the church. Maybe they'd just disappear into obscurity, their family's knightly status quietly fading away over a generation or two. The decline of knighthood wasn't a sudden thing. It happened gradually over a couple of centuries. But for individual knights living through it, it must have been bewildering and demoralizing. Everything they'd been taught, everything they'd trained for, everything they'd based their identity on was becoming obsolete. They were living fossils, relics of a system that was dying around them. Now let's talk about something we haven't really addressed yet. What happened to knights when they got old? In the modern world, we have Social Security, pensions, retirement savings. In the medieval world, you had nothing. If you couldn't work, if you couldn't fulfill your obligations, you were screwed. Old knights, if they were lucky, might have adult children who'd take care of them. But remember, those children had probably been sent away at age 7 and raised by someone else. The emotional bonds weren't always strong. And the children had their own financial struggles, their own financial strife. If you were unlucky, if you had no family, or if your family couldn't or wouldn't help, you'd end up dependent on charity. Maybe the church would take you in. Maybe your lord would provide some minimal support out of a sense of obligation. Maybe you'd just end up begging. Some old knights entered monasteries, taking religious vows and spending their final years in prayer and contemplation. This could be a genuine calling, a sincere desire to make peace with God before death, or it could be a desperate move by someone who had nowhere else to go. And remember, knights didn't live that long in the first place. The combination of combat injuries, chronic pain, repeated concussions, and generally poor medieval medicine meant that knights who made it to 50 were considered old. 60 was ancient. 70 was almost unheard of.
So you might spend 40 years as a knight, suffering through all the things we've talked about, and then get maybe a decade of being old and broken before you died. That was the best case scenario. The worst case scenario was dying young in battle, in a tournament, from an infected wound, from disease, from any of the 1,000 things that could kill a person in the Middle Ages. And lots of knights experienced that worst case scenario. Being a knight meant accepting that you'd probably die before your time, in pain, possibly alone, and definitely poor. It meant accepting that all your suffering and sacrifice would ultimately amount to nothing, because you'd be forgotten almost as soon as you were dead. Unless you were one of the tiny minority of knights who achieved fame, who got written about in chronicles and songs, you just disappear from history. Your name might appear in a few documents, if that. Your grave might be marked if you were lucky enough to be buried in a churchyard rather than a mass grave on some battlefield. And even famous knights, the ones we remember today, were still trapped in the same miserable system as everyone else. They still dealt with chronic pain, financial stress, psychological trauma. Fame didn't make any of that better. We're deep into this story now, and I want to bring things back to Guillaume for a moment, because his story isn't quite over. Remember, we left Guillaume dying alone in a barn in Burgundy. But before that final ignominious end, there was one more chapter to his life, one last humiliation that really encapsulates the whole experience of being a knight. After the siege that killed Lord Henri, after Guillaume lost everything, he wandered for a while. He was in his late 50s, broken and poor, trying to figure out what to do with whatever time he had left. And then he heard about an opportunity. There was a minor noble in Burgundy, a man named Baron Thibaut, who was raising a small force to help defend against bandit raids. He was offering a small wage for experienced fighters. It wasn't much, but it was something. So Guillaume made his way to Burgundy and presented himself. Baron Thibaut took one look at Guillaume, at this old, scarred, limping man in rusted armor, and almost laughed him out of the castle. But Guillaume insisted he could still fight, still serve, and Baron Thibaut, who was desperate for anyone with military experience, reluctantly agreed to take him on. Guillaume spent the next 3 years as basically a glorified town guard. He'd patrol the roads, escort merchants, stand watch at the Baron's castle. It was a long way from the visions of glory he'd had as a boy. It was a long way even from the grim battles of his middle years. This was just sad. The younger guards made fun of him. They'd mock his limp, his slowness, his old-fashioned ideas about warfare. Guillaume would try to teach them, try to pass on his decades of experience, and they'd roll their eyes and ignore him. To them, he was just a washed-up old man, a relic of a bygone era. Guillaume knew they were right. He was a relic. Everything he'd learned, everything he'd suffered for was obsolete. The world had moved on without him. And then, on a cold winter night when he was 61 years old, Guillaume was on patrol.
He was checking a barn on the outskirts of town, making sure no bandits were hiding there. He stepped inside, and the cold hit him like a physical blow. His lungs, already weakened from years of breathing through helmets and inhaling smoke from burning villages, couldn't handle it. He started coughing, couldn't stop. He sank down onto a pile of hay, trying to catch his breath. The coughing got worse. He could feel fluid in his lungs, could taste blood in his mouth. He knew what this meant. He'd seen enough men die to recognize the signs. Guillaume didn't try to get up, didn't try to call for help. He just lay there in the hay, feeling the cold seep into his bones, and waited for the end. As he died, what did Guillaume think about? His life of service? His lost honor? The battles he'd fought? We'll never know. There's no record of Guillaume's final thoughts, no record of his death at all, except perhaps a brief mention in some forgotten document. He died alone, unmourned, and was probably buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in Burgundy. And that's the real story of medieval knights, not glorious heroes, but ordinary men trapped in an extraordinary system of violence and exploitation. Men who suffered and died for a system that didn't care about them, that used them up and discarded them without a second thought.
Now, we're coming toward the end of this journey through Guillaume's life and the broader experience of medieval knighthood, but there's still more ground to cover. We need to talk about some of the specific aspects of knight culture that made life even more unbearable. Let's discuss the concept of honor, because honor was supposed to be the defining characteristic of a knight. Your honor was everything. It determined your social standing, your marriageability, your lord's trust in you. Lose your honor, and you lost everything. But here's the problem. Honor was incredibly fragile and incredibly arbitrary. You could lose your honor for the smallest perceived slight. If someone insulted you and you didn't challenge them, you were a coward. If you challenged them and lost, you were weak. If you won by fighting dirty, you were dishonorable. If you didn't fight because the insult wasn't worth it, you were letting people walk all over you. There was no winning. The rules of honor were designed to be impossible to follow perfectly, which meant that everyone was constantly vulnerable to accusations of dishonor. And challenges to honor often led to duels, which were just stupid. Two men would fight, sometimes to the death, over something trivial like who got to sit where at a feast or who said something rude about whom. It was a waste of life and talent, but it was expected. Refusing to duel when challenged was social suicide. Guillaume fought several duels over his lifetime. He won most of them, but not because he was particularly skilled at dueling. He won because he was willing to fight dirty, to use every trick he knew, to do whatever it took to survive. And then he'd have to live with having killed men over trivial matters, adding more weight to the burden of guilt he carried. The honor culture of knighthood was toxic in every sense of the word. It demanded constant violence, constant posturing, constant vigilance against insult. It made genuine friendships difficult because every interaction was a potential conflict. It made knights paranoid and aggressive, always ready to fight, always looking for disrespect. And it was all performative. Everyone knew the honor code was ridiculous. Everyone knew that knights regularly violated it when convenient, but they all had to pretend to take it seriously, had to maintain the fiction that honor mattered, because the alternative was admitting that the whole system was a sham. Let's also talk about the relationship between knights and the church, because this was more complicated than it might seem. The church needed knights. It needed military force to protect its lands, to enforce its authority, to wage crusades against heretics and heathens. So the church promoted the idea of Christian knighthood, of warriors serving God. But the church also condemned violence. Thou shalt not kill is pretty unambiguous. The church had to perform theological gymnastics to explain why it was okay for knights to kill as long as they were killing the right people.
But this created cognitive dissonance for devout knights. They'd go to confession, admit to killing people, and the priest would absolve them because they'd been killing enemies of the church. But what if some of those enemies were just regular people who happened to be born in the wrong place? What if some of those killings were unnecessary, excessive, cruel? The church's answer was basically, don't worry about it, you're serving a higher purpose. But that answer didn't satisfy everyone. Some knights struggled with genuine moral and theological questions about their role. If killing is wrong, how can it be right when I do it? If violence is sinful, how can I be a good Christian while making violence my profession? Some knights resolved this by becoming more brutal, figuring they were already damned, so they might as well embrace it. Others became more pious, spending hours in prayer, making generous donations to the church, desperately trying to earn salvation despite their violent lives. Others just learned to compartmentalize, to separate their faith from their actions, to not think too hard about the contradictions.
The church, for its part, was happy to take knights' money and use their military power while maintaining a careful moral distance from the actual violence. It was a hypocritical arrangement that satisfied nobody, but persisted because it was mutually beneficial. We should also discuss the feudal obligations that bound knights to their lords, because this relationship was at the heart of why being a knight sucked so much. When you became a knight in service to a lord, you swore an oath of fealty. This oath bound you to serve your lord, to fight for him, to give him counsel when asked, to provide military service for a certain number of days per year, usually around 40 days. In exchange, your lord was supposed to protect you, provide you with land or income, and support you when you needed help. It was supposed to be a reciprocal relationship, a bond of mutual obligation and respect. In practice, it was nothing like that. The relationship was inherently unequal. Your lord had all the power. If your lord decided to violate his obligations to you, what were you going to do about it? Complain? To whom? There was no court system that would rule against a powerful noble in favor of a minor knight. There was no way to hold lords accountable. So lords would regularly demand more than the agreed-upon 40 days of service. They'd call their knights to campaign after campaign, year after year, without providing adequate compensation. They'd promise rewards that never materialized. They'd make decisions that put their knights in danger without consultation. And knights had to accept it. Breaking your oath of fealty was one of the worst things a knight could do. You'd be branded an oath breaker, a traitor. You'd lose your land, your status, everything. Other lords wouldn't trust you. Other knights would shun you. You'd be effectively exiled from your social class. So knights endured abuse from their lords because they had no choice. They swallowed their anger and resentment and kept serving, kept fighting, kept dying for men who often didn't give a damn about them. Guillaume experienced this firsthand. Lord Bertrand and later Lord Henri made decisions that cost Guillaume years of his life, caused him countless injuries, and nearly got him killed multiple times. They demanded more service than they were entitled to, paid less than they'd promised, and treated Guillaume as a disposable asset. But Guillaume kept serving, because what else could he do? His entire identity was built around being a knight in service to the Montfort family. Without that, he was nothing. This is what trapped knights in their misery, not just the physical hardships or the psychological trauma, but the social and economic structures that made escape impossible. You couldn't just walk away from being a knight. It was a lifetime commitment, often a generational commitment. Your family's status depended on it. Your children's futures depended on it. Your entire social network depended on it. So you endured and endured and endured until your body gave out, or you died in combat, or you just collapsed under the weight of it all. Let's talk now about something we've mentioned but haven't fully explored, the treatment of prisoners in medieval warfare. When a knight was captured in battle, His fate depended entirely on his value. If you were a high-ranking noble, a wealthy knight, someone whose family could pay a substantial ransom, you'd be treated quite well. You'd be housed comfortably, fed properly, allowed to maintain your dignity. Your captors had a financial incentive to keep you healthy and safe until the ransom was paid. But if you were a minor knight, someone without wealthy family or connections, you were in trouble. Your captors might keep you prisoner for months or years, waiting to see if anyone would pay for your release. During that time, you'd be kept in poor conditions, given minimal food, possibly mistreated. And if it became clear that no ransom was coming, if your family couldn't or wouldn't pay, you might simply be killed, or you might be forced to swear allegiance to your captor, essentially switching sides. Or you might be sold into slavery, though this was less common in Western Europe.
Guillaume's experience as a prisoner after Poitiers was typical of what happened to minor knights. He was captured, thrown in a cell, and then forgotten about for months. Nobody cared about him. He wasn't valuable enough to warrant attention. He was just another captured knight among thousands, waiting to see if anyone would buy his freedom. The psychological impact of captivity was severe. You'd go from being a knight, a warrior, someone with at least some status and agency, to being completely powerless. You'd be at the mercy of your captors, with no control over your fate. Days would blur into weeks, weeks into months. You'd have no idea if you'd ever get out, if you'd ever see your home again. Some prisoners broke mentally. They'd become shells of themselves, passive and defeated. Others became bitter and angry, nursing grudges that would last the rest of their lives. Some found ways to cope, to maintain their sanity through prayer or meditation, or just sheer stubborn refusal to give up. And when prisoners were finally released, either through ransom or prisoner exchange, they'd often be in terrible shape, malnourished, sick, psychologically damaged. They'd need months to recover, if they recovered at all. And then they'd be expected to resume their duties as knights, to fight again, to risk capture again. The possibility of capture hung over every knight like a sword. It could happen to anyone, at any time. All it took was one unlucky moment in battle, one horse going down at the wrong time, one opponent getting the better of you, and then you'd be a prisoner, your fate entirely in someone else's hands. Now I want to talk about something that might seem minor, but was actually a huge part of daily life for knights: maintenance. Everything a knight owned required constant maintenance. Armor needed to be cleaned after every use, oiled to prevent rust, checked for damage, repaired when necessary. This was hours of work. You'd have to remove every piece of armor, clean off the dirt and blood, inspect it carefully for cracks or dents or broken straps, oil it thoroughly, then store it properly. Weapons needed constant care too. Swords had to be sharpened regularly, oiled to prevent rust, checked for cracks or chips in the blade. Lances had to be replaced frequently because they broke in combat or training. Bows needed new strings. Crossbows needed maintenance on their mechanical components. Horses required enormous amounts of care. They needed to be fed, watered, groomed, their hooves maintained, their tack cleaned and repaired. They got sick frequently and needed treatment. They got injured and needed time to heal. A war horse was a huge investment and a huge responsibility. For a knight with a squire and servants, much of this work was delegated, but you still had to oversee it, make sure it was being done properly. And if you were a poor knight without servants, you had to do it all yourself. Guillaume spent countless hours maintaining his equipment. It was tedious, boring work, but it was essential. Neglect your armor, and it would rust and fail when you needed it most. Neglect your weapons, and they'd break in combat. Neglect your horse, and you'd be fighting on foot at a massive disadvantage. This maintenance work never ended. It was a constant background task, eating up time and energy. And it was just one more way that being a knight was exhausting, one more burden added to an already overwhelming load. Let's talk about injuries in more detail, because we've mentioned them frequently,
but haven't really explored the full horror of medieval medicine. When Guillaume got injured in battle, and he got injured frequently, the treatment was primitive at best. For minor wounds, cuts, and scrapes, they'd clean the wound with wine or vinegar, which actually helped prevent infection, though they didn't understand why. Then they'd bandage it and hope for the best. For more serious wounds, things got medieval, literally. If you had a deep cut, they might cauterize it with a hot iron, burning the flesh to stop the bleeding and seal the wound. This was agonizingly painful and often led to worse infections. If you had a broken bone, they'd try to set it, pulling and manipulating the bone back into position. No anesthesia, just maybe some alcohol to dull the pain. Then they'd splint it and hope it healed properly. Many broken bones didn't heal right, leaving knights with permanent deformities and chronic pain. If you got an infected wound, which happened all the time, the treatments were worse than useless. They'd try to bleed you, the universal medieval cure for everything, which just weakened you further. They'd apply poultices made from herbs, animal dung, or other substances that often introduced more infection. They'd pray, and if none of that worked, they'd consider amputation.
Medieval amputation was a nightmare. The surgeon, who might just be a barber with some experience cutting things, would saw through your limb with a regular saw. No anesthesia, except maybe wine or herbal preparations that barely dulled the pain. You'd be held down by several strong men while you screamed. Then they'd cauterize the stump with hot irons to stop the bleeding. The survival rate for amputation was maybe 50%, and that's being generous. Most people died from blood loss, shock, or infection. Those who survived were left disabled in a world that had no place for disabled people. Guillaume saw all of this, experienced much of it himself. He had scars from cauterization, bones that had healed crooked, chronic infections that flared up periodically. His body was a map of medieval medical practice, and every scar told a story of suffering. And here's the thing, knights couldn't complain about their injuries. Complaining was seen as weakness. You were expected to tough it out, to keep fighting even when injured, to not let pain slow you down. The culture of knighthood demanded stoicism, demanded that you suffer in silence. So knights would fight through broken ribs, through infected wounds, through pain that would have modern people in the emergency room. They'd ride with saddle sores that were infected and oozing. They'd swing swords with broken fingers. They'd march for days with stress fractures in their feet. Because if you admitted you were hurt, if you asked to rest, you'd be seen as weak. Your lord would lose confidence in you. Your fellow knights would mock you. Your enemies would target you, sensing vulnerability. The only acceptable reason to stop fighting was being physically unable to continue. And even then, you'd be expected to recover as quickly as possible and get back to your duties. This culture of toughness and stoicism might seem admirable on the surface, but in practice, it meant that knights pushed their bodies far beyond reasonable limits, causing permanent damage, shortening their lives, and living in constant pain. Before we continue deeper into this historical nightmare, let me remind you one more time, if this kind of historical deep dive is your thing, if you're fascinated by the reality behind the myths, make sure you're subscribed to Dreamless Timelines. Hit that bell icon so you never miss an upload. Leave a comment telling me what historical topic you want me to demolish next, and smash that like button if you appreciate content that doesn't romanticize the past. Your engagement genuinely helps me keep making these exhaustive historical explorations. Now, let's talk about something that affected every aspect of a knight's life, the weather. People don't think much about how weather affected medieval life, but it was absolutely central. And for knights, who spent so much time outdoors, traveling, camping, fighting, the weather could be a constant source of misery. In summer, knights had to deal with heat. Remember, they're wearing armor made of metal, which absorbs and holds heat. On a hot summer day, the inside of a suit of armor could easily reach 120 or 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Knights would cook inside their armor, sweating profusely, becoming dehydrated and overheated. Heat exhaustion and heat stroke were common. Knights would faint inside their armor, collapse during marches, become delirious during battles. And once you were overheated and dehydrated, you were vulnerable. Your reactions slowed, your judgment got clouded, you made mistakes that could get you killed. In winter, the problem was cold. Metal conducts heat away from your body very efficiently, so armor made you colder, not warmer. Knights would layer clothing underneath, but it didn't help much. They'd be constantly cold, fingers and toes going numb, joints stiffening up. And if you fell into water in winter while wearing armor, you'd die. The shock of the cold water combined with the weight of the armor pulling you down meant you'd drown in minutes, possibly seconds. There were accounts of knights drowning in rivers and moats, unable to swim or remove their armor in time. Rain was another constant problem. Armor would rust if it got wet and wasn't dried properly. So after marching or fighting in the rain, knights had to spend hours cleaning and oiling their armor. And if you were on campaign, living in a tent or sleeping rough, you might not have the time or resources to do this properly. Your armor would start to rust, would become less effective, might even fall apart. Clothing would get soaked and stay wet for days, leading to rashes, chafing, fungal infections. Leather straps and boots would rot. Weapons would rust. Everything would become damp and miserable.
And campaigns didn't stop for bad weather. If your lord ordered a march, you marched, rain or shine or snow. If there was a battle, you fought, regardless of the weather. Knights had to function in conditions that would have modern armies sitting tight and waiting for improvement. Guillaume experienced every kind of weather misery. He'd fought in summer heat so intense he'd vomited inside his helmet. He'd marched through winter storms, so cold his fingers couldn't grip his sword properly. He'd slept in the mud during week-long rains, everything he owned soaked through. He'd developed infections from wet clothing, rust burns from armor that hadn't been dried properly, frostbite from winter campaigns. The weather was just one more thing that made life as a knight miserable, one more source of constant discomfort and occasional danger. Let's talk now about the diet of knights, because what you ate had a huge impact on your ability to function, and medieval military diet was not great. At home, if you were a reasonably successful knight with your own lands, you'd eat fairly well. Meat, bread, cheese, vegetables, ale, or wine. The food was plain by modern standards, heavily salted to preserve it, often kind of gross by our standards, but it was adequate nutrition. On campaign, though, food became a major problem. Armies needed to feed thousands of men and horses, and medieval logistics were pretty terrible. Supply trains would break down, get ambushed, simply run out of food. Foraged food from the countryside would run out as the army stripped the land bare. Knights would often go days with inadequate food. They'd eat whatever was available, hard bread, dried meat, maybe some foraged vegetables or fruit. The quality and quantity were unpredictable. Sometimes you'd have plenty, sometimes you'd be half starving. Malnutrition was common on campaign. Knights would lose weight, become weak, their wounds would heal slowly. Scurvy was common on long campaigns, causing bleeding gums, loose teeth, and general debilitation. Dysentery was even more common, caused by contaminated food and water, leaving men weak and dehydrated. And remember, knights were expected to fight while dealing with all of this. You'd be malnourished, possibly sick, definitely uncomfortable, and you'd still have to put on 70 pounds of armor and fight for your life. Guillaume experienced multiple campaigns where food ran out. He'd watch men around him sicken and die, not from combat, but from starvation and disease. He'd fight battles while so hungry he could barely think straight. He'd develop scurvy, his gums bleeding, his teeth loose, his body falling apart from the inside. The famous siege of Calais during the 100 Years' War lasted nearly a year. The defenders were reduced to eating rats, dogs, leather, anything that might have some nutritional value. When the city finally surrendered, the surviving defenders were skeletal, barely able to walk. Many died shortly after from the effects of prolonged starvation, even after food became available again. This wasn't unusual. This was what happened during sieges, during long campaigns, during any military operation that lasted more than a few weeks. Food would run out, and men would suffer. And knights couldn't just leave. They were bound by their oaths to stay and serve. So they stayed and starved and fought and died, because that's what being a knight meant. Now let's discuss something that might seem trivial, but was actually incredibly important: sleep. Knights rarely got enough sleep. When you're on campaign, you're either marching, fighting, standing guard, or maintaining your equipment. There's not much time left for sleeping, and the sleep you do get is often interrupted and poor quality. You'd sleep in armor sometimes if there was danger of attack. You'd sleep on the ground in all weather with minimal bedding. You'd sleep in shifts if you were standing guard. You'd wake up to alarms, to attacks, to orders to move out. Chronic sleep deprivation has severe effects. Your reaction time slows. Your judgment becomes impaired. You become irritable and emotional. You're more prone to making mistakes, and mistakes in medieval warfare could get you killed.
But there was no choice. The demands of military service didn't care about your need for sleep. You slept when you could, however much you could, and functioned on whatever rest you managed to get. Guillaume often went days with only a few hours of sleep. He'd fall asleep while sitting up, would sleep through storms and noise because he was so exhausted. He'd wake up more tired than when he'd gone to sleep, his body aching, his mind foggy. And then he'd have to put on his armor and fight, because that was the job. Let's talk about one more aspect of knightly life that made everything worse: the constant travel. Knights were always moving, traveling to tournaments, traveling to war, traveling to attend on their lords, traveling to manage their lands. Medieval travel was slow, uncomfortable, and dangerous. Roads were terrible, often just muddy tracks that turned into impassable morasses in bad weather. Bridges were rare, so you'd have to ford rivers, which was dangerous and uncomfortable. Inns existed, but were expensive and often full. Most nights on the road, you'd sleep rough, in forests or fields, exposed to weather and bandits. Traveling in armor was especially miserable. The weight would wear you down over days and weeks. The constant bouncing and jostling while riding would aggravate every injury, every ache. Saddle sores would develop and get infected. And travel was dangerous. Bandits targeted travelers, especially nobles and knights who might be carrying valuables. Roads through forests were particularly risky. You might be ambushed, robbed, killed. Even if you were armed and armored, a well-planned ambush could take you down. Guillaume spent a huge portion of his life traveling, weeks and months on the road, riding from place to place, dealing with bad weather and bad roads and the constant discomfort of travel. His longest journey was probably when he went on campaign with the French army, traveling from northern France to Poitiers and back, a round trip of several hundred miles that took months. These journeys aged him. The constant physical stress, the exposure to weather, the poor food and lack of sleep, all of it accumulated, wearing down his body bit by bit. And for what? To serve a lord who didn't appreciate him, to fight in wars he didn't understand, to maintain a system that treated him as disposable. We're in the final stretch of this long exploration of why being a medieval knight sucked, and I want to bring some of these threads together. Guillaume's life and the lives of knights like him were characterized by constant suffering with no escape. Physical suffering from injuries and chronic pain, psychological suffering from trauma and guilt, economic suffering from debt and poverty, social suffering from impossible expectations and toxic honor culture. And the system perpetuated itself because knights trained their sons to be knights, passing on the suffering to the next generation. Boys like Guillaume would watch their fathers struggle and suffer, would see them come home broken and damaged, and would still aspire to become knights themselves. Why? Because it was all they knew, because knighthood was their social identity, their family legacy,
their only path to status and recognition. Because despite all the suffering, despite all the evidence that being a knight was terrible, the mythology was powerful enough to override reality. The songs and stories about noble knights and heroic deeds served a purpose. They made the suffering seem meaningful. They gave knights a narrative framework for understanding their lives. If you could convince yourself that you were a hero, that your suffering was for a greater purpose, that you were living up to a noble ideal, then maybe you could endure it. But deep down, most knights knew it was bullshit. They knew the reality of their lives didn't match the stories. They knew they were being used and exploited. They knew that all their suffering would ultimately be forgotten, that they'd die and be replaced, and it wouldn't matter. Guillaume knew this. In his final years, as he wandered alone, as he took that pathetic job as a guard for Baron Thibaut, as he lay dying in that barn, he knew that his entire life had been a lie. All the promises of glory and honor, all the noble ideals, all of it had been a con job designed to extract military service from men who had no other options.
And the truly tragic part is that Guillaume couldn't even be angry about it. Anger would have required admitting that he'd wasted his life, that all his suffering had been for nothing. That was too painful to accept. So instead, he just faded away, gave up, died alone and unmourned, another forgotten knight in a system that produced thousands of forgotten knights. That's the real story of medieval knights. Not heroic warriors, but victims of a system that chewed them up and spit them out. Men who deserved better but never got it, who suffered more than any human should have to suffer, who died with their potential unfulfilled and their dreams shattered. And here's the final kick in the teeth. We remember the medieval period as the age of chivalry, the time of noble knights. We've romanticized it, turned it into fairy tales and fantasies, erased all the suffering and brutality and made it seem appealing. We've done to medieval knights in our collective memory what medieval poets and songwriters did in their time. We've lied about how terrible it actually was. We've created a mythology that serves our purposes, that gives us heroes to admire and stories to tell, without caring about the reality of what those men actually experienced. Guillaume and the thousands of knights like him deserved better than that. They deserved to be remembered as they really were, ordinary men trying to survive in an impossible situation, doing their best with what they had, suffering more than we can truly imagine. So the next time you see a movie about knights in shining armor, the next time you read a fantasy novel about noble warriors, the next time you play a video game where you're a heroic knight, remember Guillaume. Remember that the real experience of being a medieval knight was nothing like the fantasy. Remember that behind every suit of armor was a human being dealing with pain and trauma and economic stress and psychological damage. Remember that being a knight sucked. Really, truly, completely sucked. And the men who lived through it were tougher and more resilient than we give them credit for. Not because they were heroes, but because they endured when any sensible person would have given up. Guillaume's story is over. He died in that barn in Burgundy, probably from pneumonia or some other respiratory infection, definitely from a lifetime of accumulated damage to his body. His armor was probably scavenged and sold for scrap. His sword was probably taken by whoever found him. His body was probably buried in an unmarked grave, or maybe just left for animals. No one mourned him, no one remembered him. He disappeared from history as completely as if he'd never existed. Except he did exist. He and thousands like him really lived these lives, really suffered through everything we've talked about. They were real people with hopes and dreams and fears, not characters in a story or pieces on a chessboard. And now, hundreds of years later,
we can at least acknowledge their suffering. We can tell their stories honestly without the romantic gloss. We can recognize that the medieval period, for all its fascinating history and cultural achievements, was also a time of tremendous human suffering. We can remember that being a knight wasn't glorious. It was brutal, painful, traumatic, and ultimately meaningless for the most of the men who lived that life. We can remember Guillaume and all the forgotten knights like him, and understand that their true heroism wasn't in the battles they fought or the tournaments they won. It was simply surviving, day after day, year after year, in a system designed to destroy them. That's the real story. That's the truth behind the myth of medieval knighthood. And if this deep dive into historical reality has been worth your time, if you've made it all the way to the end of this journey through Guillaume's life and the broader experience of medieval knights, then please do me one final favor. Subscribe to Dreamless Timelines if you haven't already. Leave a comment telling me what you thought, what other historical myths you want me to explore, what other uncomfortable truths you want to learn about. Hit that like button to help this video reach more people who appreciate honest history. Because these stories matter. The real stories, not the sanitized, romanticized versions. The stories of actual human suffering and endurance. The stories that remind us that history wasn't a fairy tale, it was real life. And real life is often brutally hard.
Thank you for taking this journey with me. Thank you for listening to Guillaume's story, for learning about what being a medieval knight really meant, for engaging with history on a deeper level than the myths and legends allow. Sleep well, knowing that whatever challenges you face, you're probably not dealing with anything as comprehensively awful as being a medieval knight. And when you wake up tomorrow, maybe take a moment to appreciate modern medicine, modern law, modern economics, and all the other things that make our lives incomparably better than the lives of people like Guillaume. The past was terrible. Be grateful you live now, not then. Good night.